Disclaimer: this story contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and other content that modern viewers might find upsetting. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading from The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres, and I will be reading Chapter 10. But for all Barbara Weir's breathless hurry, she was too late, and 2 days dragged by on leaden feet before the disinterested thousands who had never heard of Linda Hyde or the tragedy of her life read in a newspaper paragraph that the body of a woman found in the Thames has been identified as that of Linda Mary Hyde, wife of Edmund Hyde of Great Longton, Surrey. And there followed the usual kindly suggestions of a nervous breakdown and expressions of sympathy with the heartbroken husband. And that was the end of the search. They had been days of nightmare to Barbara, and it was with a sense of unutterable relief that she knew the suspense was ended. If only I'd kept awake that afternoon! If only I hadn't let myself sleep! She said passionately many times to Edmund. I blame myself! I blame myself! That's absurd, he answered roughly. You are to blame less than any of us. You were kind to her. And he stopped, choked by the memory of the last time he saw his wife, and the way in which he had driven her from him. If only I can shield her memory, he said again after a moment. But people are talking. They are bound to talk. But the truth never really came out, though there were many conjectures and unkind suggestions. The past will bury itself, Barbara comforted him. It's wonderful how quickly things are forgotten. Edmund laughed mirthlessly. According to Asher, this will never be forgotten until he stands face to face with Langley, he said grimly. And when he does, well, God help Langley. Barbara made no reply. She had not spoken to Asher since that day in the hotel, though once or twice she had caught glimpses of him, and been grieved by the change and tragedy in his face. He had taken Linda's death more to heart than any of them. His love for her had been the greatest thing in his life, and Barbara knew that he would never cease to blame himself for not having been kinder on that last tragic afternoon. Mr. Asher, what will he do? She asked Edmund timidly, and Edmund shook his head. Don't ask me. I don't profess to understand the fellow. He looks as ill as a dog, I know that. I suppose he'll go back to Australia. He had tried to make friends with his brother-in-law, and Asher had done his best to respond, but both men were aware of failure. Asher had refused to stay in Edmund's house. I'm better alone, had been his excuse. This place is haunted for me. So it was. At every corner he seemed to come face to face with the sad-eyed ghost of his sister and the sound of her laugh. One night, when circumstances had forced him to stay in the house, he had not been able to sleep for the haunting sound of a foxtrot tune rattled out on a gramophone, as he had once heard it. And men who've stayed home all their lives are dancing every night with other fellows' wives. His madness and folly had dated from that night, and now the result would have no ending, would never end until the sun went down on his life. He tried not to think of Barbara, but she was never out of his thoughts. Coming out of his room, he seemed to see again her little slippers with their high red heels, as he had seen them outside her door. He seemed to see her turning to smile good night to him, and to hear her voice again. See you in the morning. What a fool he had been! Surely madness had taken possession of him, and had only left him now to the bitterness of sanity. He went back to London as soon as Linda was buried, and for a week he roamed about, too wretched to make plans, just killing time, and wearing himself out. If he slept, it was only to dream of those days which he and Barbara had passed down at the cottage, to hear the sound of the wind in the trees, and the rain spattering down on the leaves, to see again Barbara's frightened eyes across the firelight, to hear again her voice with its brave attempt at defiance, and it seemed to him that with each recurring memory his villainy grew. How he had misjudged her! No wonder she would not speak to him or take his hand. They had met for a few moments beside Linda's grave, and she had studiously avoided his eyes, and kept as far from him as possible. There was nothing for him to hope for, no place for him on this side of the ocean. Then one day he made up his mind, and, walking into a shipping office, booked a passage back to Australia. Perhaps out there he would be able to pick up the threads of his life afresh. Perhaps out there he would learn once more to throw back his head and breathe the fresh air of freedom. He wrote to tell Hyde of his decision, but he got no reply to his letter, and then the night before he was to sail he heard from a mutual acquaintance that his brother-in-law had gone abroad. "The best thing he can do," Asher said. "It's what I'm going to do myself next week." The man who told him looked at him commiseratingly. "Yes, you've both had a rotten time," he agreed, and then after a moment he asked, "What's become of Barbara Weir? Do you remember her? She was down at Hyde's place the last time I was there." He was surprised at the change in Asher's face, at the color that beat into his brown skin, and the way in which his hard lips tightened. "I don't know. I haven't seen her lately," he answered doggedly, and then presently, "Why do you ask?" "Oh, I don't know." The other man seemed to avoid looking at him. "I always thought she and Hyde were, well, no offense meant, you know, but I couldn't help seeing that swine Langley." He broke off helplessly, realizing that he had gone too far, but Asher made no reply. He sat for a moment, staring down at the floor. Then he got up abruptly and walked away without another word. The demon of jealousy had him by the throat again, choking him. Barbara and Edmund, so others had thought of the possibility besides himself, and no doubt, now Linda had gone, that was what would someday happen. He tramped the streets for hours, unconscious of weariness or the cold wind that blew, unconscious of everything but his own jealousy. She might have loved him if he had not been such a fool. That knowledge made his punishment hard to bear. She might have loved him. Well, she did not love him now, that was certain. After tomorrow, all chance of seeing her again would have gone. After tomorrow, the field would be clear for Edmund, or any other man. Then suddenly he made up his mind. He would see her once before he left England. He would see her again, or die. As far as he knew, she was still at the hotel, and in desperation he turned his steps in its direction. The wind had dropped and rain was falling. It reminded him of the dark nights down at the cottage, and the ceaselessly falling rain. Those days had been hell to him, when they might have been heaven. He walked into the hotel and stood for a moment, blinded by the glare of the many lights. Then he turned towards the stairs and began to make his way up to Barbara's rooms. He had not much hope that she would be there, but he knew that he meant to find her and see her once more before he left England. And then, as he stood outside her closed door, afraid to knock, it opened and she came out. And they stood looking at one another speechlessly, and it seemed to Barbara that in the silence she could hear the beating of her heart before Asher found his voice. "Don't look so frightened. I've only come to say goodbye. I'm leaving England tomorrow. I shall never come back again." She tried to answer, but her voice seemed to have died away, and she pushed the door wide again behind her, and they went into the sitting room together. Her trunk stood about the room, half-packed. One of them, the one he had unstrapped for her that first night down at the cottage, was all ready, corded and locked. Asher looked at them and back to her white face. "You are going away?" "Yes, tomorrow." And then the tragic silence fell once more and was unbroken till Asher began to plead, his voice ragged with emotion and stress of grief. "Forgive me before I go. I'd give my life gladly if it would undo the past. I've been an unspeakable cad, and yet, for God's sake, say you forgive me." Barbara turned her face away and closed her eyes. Then she said, "I told Linda I could never forgive you. I told Linda." She failed for a moment, then struggled on. "I did not understand why I could not, but I know now. It was because I loved you, and it hurt. The way you treated me, it hurt so unspeakably." Asher gave a stifled groan. "Ugh, Barbara! Oh, for God's sake!" She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You are going back to Australia tomorrow? On the Auravia?" "Yes." She put out her hand and closed it about his clenched fingers. "I am coming with you." He stared at her like a blind man to whom sight had suddenly been restored. Then he gave a choking cry and stumbled towards her. "Barbara! Barbara! Barbara! Ruffo! Dear Ruffo!" She was sobbing unrestrainedly, the tears streaming down her face, as Asher took her in his arms, holding her as if he feared even now that someone would take her from him. Forgive me, I shall never forgive myself. I say it again. I love you. Say it again. Let me see your eyes when you say it. She flung back her head and looked at him. I love you. I think I've always loved you. It seemed as if he could not believe her. He was shaking from head to foot. Is it true? I'm not dreaming. Barbara, may I kiss you? Please kiss me. And it was long before either of them spoke again, till Barbara laid her head against his breast with a deep sigh of contentment. Ruffo, I can hear it beating. You've got a heart after all, then. He shook his head and laughed shakily. No, I gave it to you the first time we met. She looked up, flushing adorably. Really? Did you love me then? I adored you. Her eyes clouded. But you believed I... He laid his hand over her lips. Don't say it. I can't bear to hear you say it. I'm so ashamed, to the depths of my soul. Will you ever really forgive me? I don't deserve it. I deserve nothing from you. She was silent for a moment. Then she said with quivering lips, Ruffo, you once said that women were queer things. Well, do you know that I only knew I loved you when you were such a brute to me in this very room, that last night? He turned his face against her shoulder, as if he could not bear her eyes to read its shame and humility, and the tears that fell were not only hers. And that is the end. Thank you for listening to The Man Without a Heart by Ruby M. Ayres with me, and I hope that you enjoyed this story and have a great day. Bye!